Good afternoon, good evening. This is today I'm speaking to Lucia Pietroiusti. Have I got the name right?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, great. Who's in London? And thank you very much for finding the time and joining me today. Lucia has been curating a very major intervention at the Serpentine Gallery in London called General Ecology. And that's how I got to know of her. But she's also one of the editors of this fantastic book called More Than Human, which everybody should get hold of and have a look at. It's not usual to find somebody like Lucia and a major gallery like the Serpentine to do a long-term investment in a project like General Ecology. It's not just a show, it's an ongoing thing going on. So I'd like to first start asking Lucia that this is a particular area of interest for you, the idea of ecology and arts.
It is, and it came about through successive kind of stages. And hi, Ravi, very nice to be in conversation with you, by the way. So the emergence of the ecological and the environmental into my own practice, well, my own soul first and foremost, and then practice, happened in multiple stages. I think probably the beginning of it was in 2014, where I co-curated with our artistic director at the Serpentine, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, one of the yearly festivals of ideas that we used to hold across different disciplines, the marathon, which you probably know quite well. And that year in 2014, the marathon was on the subject of extinction, many different types of extinction. And it was the artist Gustav Metzger that had prompted this, whose work obviously was for decades dedicated to sort of raising alarm against the extinction of species and being. And that research was so impactful on me personally, as well as I think the kind of community of audiences that joined us, that I remember very clearly at the time that we were brainstorming what could be the following marathon subject. I remember saying to Hans-Ulrich, I feel like we should do the extinction marathon every year. The theme should just stay the same until, we can say something optimistic about the state of the environment in the world, which is essentially was a suggestion of making it an infinite project, right?
Right, correct.
Then a couple of years, as it happened, the marathons that happened after that transformation and miracle were within a logic that, in my, at least, curatorial view, had to do with finding strategies to address things like environmental imbalance and environmental injustice, even though they sort of took different terms to enter into those ideas. And then in 2017, I had a baby, and weirdly, that experience kind of cemented the feeling, the very strong sense that I had of relationality with a more than human being, even though a baby is a human, but they also have kind of communication strategies and timings and rhythms, and behaviors that are not kind of adult human behaviors. And so, it also kind of opened up the question of time, the linearity versus circularity of time, the length of time beyond one's lifetime, responsibility for that length of time, and so on. And so when I came back, I wrote this project for the Serpentine, the General Ecology project, as a way of beginning by stringing together all of the different things that the Serpentine was already committed to in relation to the environment, and then use that coherent stringing together of all these things to sort of build upon and have a more considered, more structured, more infrastructural dedication to the environmental. And it sort of started from these small tricks, like transform the public programs department into the General Ecology department, change my job title so that it would make a kind of structural change to the organization, and so on. And then it went on to do public outreach, and it went on to think about the mission statement of the gallery, and it went everywhere, from the most public to the most infrastructural parts of the institution. There's obviously stories after that I can tell you, that I can also tell you, but this is probably a good beginning.
So trying to, in 2014, early years with the arts, I mean, leave alone the early landscape art, or like the spiral jetty. So there's a history of that. But in the contemporary field, when ecology becomes social, political, and everything else, feminist, gender subject, where it becomes the underpinning of everything we do, kind of introducing nature as an active person, so to say, in our lives, in society. 2014 was still early days for that. And 2016, we said we want to string it together. It's still early days. I mean, it's only, even now, it's sort of people are sort of trying to make sense of it. So how did you string it? You said you wanted to, what exactly were you stringing together? What was the framework you thought about?
I think when I was writing the General Ecology project in 2018, probably I had less of a clear project in mind than I do now with the benefit of hindsight. But the idea was that the institution works in silos. It always does. And it works in disciplinary silos as well, vis-a-vis other institutions. So the notion that by starting to look at what we were doing in relation to our own building, carbon footprint, which is the thing that I'm in fact least expert about.
Yes.
All the way through to how exhibitions that we were having in the gallery were perhaps beginning to address notions around the environmental, to the way in which our live and public programs could potentially be reframed so that they always could sort of continue to ask the same question from different, or the same set of questions from different angles. So the word general in general ecology had to do with both ecology in general. So how can we think of anything from climate justice to plant intelligence to sort of climate change? How can we have a project that's kind of loose enough to hold all these right. different and complex dimensions? And also it had to do with generalizing ecology, and that's where it went a bit maybe cybernetic, which is to say, to sort of think about our infrastructure, the way that we work together within the organization, the work that we do in relation to other organizations, particularly non-our organization, and how to really kind of feed and nurture those interdisciplinary or kind of cross-industry relationships. And they came to fruition in many different ways, in as much as we now have these very open exchanges with people from law, from policy, from education, from advocacy, and so on. And when there's skills and knowledge is missing, there's the experts who spend their entire life doing this that are present, that are available, and vice versa. We as an organization have been able to, let's say, collaborate with many of those organizations to really invite them to think about art as a, active agent within these efforts, and to really kind of develop ways, very bespoke ways, in which the artists and non-art organizations could collaborate in sort of mutually beneficial ways.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this very important art as an active agent. I think that's a key sentence. But you said between then and now, you have a better idea of what's happening and how to think about this. And how have things changed? What has this project triggered off generally? What has been your perception and sense of this?
So, I mean, I guess one of the big shifts that we can notice, and that you've already brought up, is the fact that more and more artists, art organizations, and kind of the field and our audiences are becoming more attuned in a certain way. Like, it's a question of cross-disciplinary literacy, almost, like becoming more attuned to questions around the environmental. So there's definitely a coming to consciousness about that, and an emerging coming to sort of greater consciousness about issues surrounding climate justice, particularly, which I think is really definite. I mean, we're recording this only a couple of weeks after the end of COP26, and
that's right.
Having COP26 completely failed to address questions around loss and damage, climate justice, or culture for that matter.
Yeah.
And yet having these kind of luminaries like Maya Motley, or being able to kind of make that pull, we can tell that we're at the cusp of a kind of coming of a transformation of how that discourse is articulated. But so on the one hand, going back, on the one hand, the proliferation of programs around environmental questions across the entire art field is, I think, a very encouraging fact.
Yeah.
On the other, I guess one of the things that has become more clear for me over the years is that there's kind of there's something at stake that has to do with what is the sense of purpose of an organization.
Mm-hmm.
How does it think of itself as contributing positively to the present time? And how peculiar it is that most of the times organizations have actually completely forgotten about this question.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this a lot because it hit me like a lightning, that when you read these mission statements and these business plans and you read all of this, the words resilience and sustainability are always there. But what they mean are usually not planetary. They mean the sustainability and the resilience of that organization, not of the planet. So so the General Ecology project, with a benefit of hindsight, was also trying to sort of, how do you take those words and like shift them, push them into a planetary or a planetary or environmental place. And I think what then happened was the coronavirus pandemic created this moment of great crisis for museums and galleries who depended on commerce, restaurants, footfalls, visitors numbers in person. And, and then prompted by, and then you have sort of 2020 and the, really important challenges that were put to organizations and institutions across the world to do with like, how are they really handling social justice? So you've got these two things emerging at the same time, and that you can react. Organizations are like, they're like a more than human being themselves. So they can react with walls or like a nation or like anything, any institution, walls, self-protection, public PR, you put out a press release and then you hide. Or they can really think very deeply about what will make them fulfilled, what will make them thrive. And there's something that by contributing positively to the present moment, right? And there's something that I also, really strongly feel, which is we tend to think that we need to sort of fix this in order for that to be healthy. But if we start to think about sort of a just and environmentally balanced planet, ensuring the well-being of organizations and institutions, rather than thinking it the other way around, then we get a completely different set of things to do and the set of methodologies that become available to us. What that means for every individual and organization is not for me to say, but it's a question that I always want to prompt, because it seems to me like it sort of continues to feed me for sure.
Yeah, how does an institution become part of the planetary goals? How do they become in sync with planetary goals, not separate? And so even if you're thinking about yourself, while thinking about yourself, how are you also thinking of the planet? So that's a kind of a merging of a vision of a goal, that you're part of something bigger. And I think that's a big challenge, because as we saw in COP26, that is not happening very soon. Everybody's looking at contradictions between these two. But you just said a moment back, art is an active agent. And I'm really, really interested in that question, because this question of environment, climate, it's a question of policy, science, biology, biologists, even anthropologists and sociologists, disciplines, academic disciplines, even gender studies kind of thing, who have been looking at this from various angles, right? What does the artist bring to it? Why should an artist, besides the fact that the artist is like anybody else concerned about the state of the world, but why should somebody look at art to go where?
It's a really profound question. There's lots of different answers to it, because there's also lots of different forms of making art or places to make art from. But like the thing that I always start with is on a very kind of basic level, there has been art in a vast sense, like culture, cultural expression, myth, art, painting, storytelling, song, whatever, across all times and across all civilizations. So it has a function that is like non-negligible.
Yeah.
The fact that that function that doesn't correspond to quantitative measures of impact is, I think, amazing. Like that you can't measure what art's effect is in numbers means that it's one of the very few things that escapes like the hyper-surveilled, AI-driven, data-obsessed like contemporary times, you know, so it might actually be a really interesting thing.
Well
the fact
said.
that repressive regimes are so quick to censor art and artists and academics before, you know, at the very beginning of a project, of some kind of fascist project, that always is the case. So those are all clues to something, you know, there's like a three-dimensional object that it's pointing to that we can't quite focus in on, and maybe that's the point. But from the point of view of art and the environment, there's obviously the kind of immediate layer, which is probably the most prominent one, which, you know, if you speak to a climate scientist, they say we absolutely need artists to communicate and to make things emotional and sensible and embodied and enfleshed, and to have these like sensible experiences of complex data. But I also think that there's something, you know, and there's also decades of practice of this, there's something really interesting about what happens when the mode of thinking of an artist enters environments that aren't art environments. Like, how does it change the dynamics? How does it change what we see? How does it sort of subtly start to shift the conversation? And then there's like something that I found out through the latest project I'm working on at the Serpentine, which is called Back to Earth, which broadly speaking is an invitation to a number of artists to propose artworks that are also environmental campaigns or initiatives, is that by calling something an artwork, you're mobilizing an entirely different kind of framework of support, audiences, and visibility, and access to, you know, if you want to speak truth to power, how do you make your way in front of that audience? So even those kinds of accesses. That projects that are environmental, but that cite themselves in environmental world, might actually have a harder time achieving, just because of the fact of, you know, maybe sheer kind of, how do you say, like traffic jams, like that there's so many environmental campaigns and so much competition between NGOs, for example, for funding. So much of this is happening that it's actually very hard. It might be very hard to bring something to fruition. So I'm just saying, so sort of I'm interested in systems and how you can kind of play those systems. And art definitely participates in those. And then we could go on and on and on, but a slightly more esoteric part of thinking about art and the environment, for me, has to do with all this work I did on researching kind of plant and plant history and plant mythology, and realizing that actually those histories and mythologies were sort of forms of memory about agriculture. You know, how do you remember when to plant, what the constellations should look like? You create myth, you create oral tradition, you turn them into gods and goddesses and personal dramas and so on. You do that not to be anthropocentric, but actually to be more than human and remember it as a human. So art holds the deep time memory of our relationship with the earth. There's no, and with the stars, in fact, our relationship with the universe. There's no question about it when you go back.
So by saying that, you know, if we just extend that, when you're talking of traditional systems, indigenous knowledge systems of, because if you're talking of memory and looking at the sky and the cosmos for signs of when to do what, or, you know, feel the humidity in the air to know what's going to happen, what's happening. These are sort of the kind of knowledge systems we seem to be losing today, and we are talking more and more about, because they are indicating a knowledge system we seem to have not being able to quantify and hence ignored in a sense. It's like a modernity and this methods of science do not acknowledge them. And so it also, when we do this, we take away these sort of categories of what is contemporary art, or what is knowledge, and how do other forms become contemporary in a sense, which has been sort of a big debate in the art of what is contemporary, you know, in a sense, or what, and philosophical writing about it also. So I mean, when we think about this, then how does it influence art practice? I mean, in this General Ecology program, you have had many artists participating, besides also people from other disciplines. But from what I've seen on the web, if there was no COVID, I'd be there and see it myself, but there is COVID. So, but what I've seen on the web, it's fascinating. But what I'm also interested in, how art practices are changing today, because there's always this fear which art has about being instrumentalized. And so I always, I'm a strong supporter of, I really feel art brings on something new. It's like a new piece of sculpture changes the space in which the sculpture is kept. It reforms something. It's a new discursive object. It's not just a representation of something else. It's not an extension of science. It brings a new debate to the table. I think it's an independent agency of its own, because it comes from another sense, human sense. So in all these sort of ruptures within what was traditionally art, what is becoming, and your experience with this long project, what would you like to say about how art practice it might be shifting, or how curators like you might be viewing art practice? And what would the horizons to which we view them, not only from the art historical horizon, but from other horizons? I know it's a very broad question, but it's something you must have thought about a lot, I'm sure.
Yes, so I wanted to just touch on the comments that you made at the beginning of that question around kind of indigenous knowledge systems and tradition, and the notion of what is contemporary. I think hegemonic culture, whether one wants to put it in the West or in the global North or in the Northwest or in white supremacy, whatever it might be, hegemonic culture has like a really big problem with space and time. Weirdly. Time, because it assumes that, actually both time and space, because it assumes that something like climate breakdown is in the future, when actually, so it assumes that it exists on a continuum of time, that climate breakdown is somewhere on a line of time, whereas actually it's somewhere as a point in space, in this time, right? So the front line of climate breakdown is simply not in the global North at the moment. And so, and conversely, it also assumes that something that is a point in space, in terms of like a knowledge practice, that isn't the hegemonic knowledge practice, is also somewhere on a line of time but behind. None of those things, it's sort of almost like misunderstanding space for time. It's a very strange kind of cognitive incapacity. Also based on a notion of linear time, which anyways is like questioned left, right, and center, including by quantum physics. So it's like there is no basis for thinking about time linearly, except for the limitations of our own kind of paradigm.
Ability to sense something,
Ability to sense it, but also paradigm. Because I have timings that are circular. I mean, as a woman, obviously, I have timings that are circular. I exist in timings that are seasonal, and therefore there's a kind of linear progression with a return, you know. We wake up every day. So we could highlight the paradigm that we see time as linear is actually not consistent with all of the experiences of time, as I'm sure, I mean, we all share this. And also that these kind of, these knowledges are held all over the place. They're held in motherhood, they're held in plant knowledge, and it's not necessarily the case. So one of the things that has emerged with big data, the influence of big data on pharmaceutical research, is that the amount of data accumulated and tested through artificial intelligence, you know, like make and remake molecules
Yeah.
through AI and try and invent new compounds that work for one thing or another. It has exponentially increased, but the new discoveries have actually plateaued.
Yeah.
So there's a point at which more data doesn't yield
New discoveries.
more than, you know, like than letting bread mold on the table and discovering penicillin. So
yeah.
So all that like what is known as, what is talked about as informal knowledge, but I would really like question that statement, is found kind of immediately around us as well. It's not, it's also not, it doesn't have to be, I mean, it happens to be a lot of like, you know, agroforestry, indigenous, Brazilian indigenous agroforestry, yes. But it's also these like, it's everywhere.
Out of the lived experience.
In lived experience.
Yes.
And in kind of, you know, intergenerational experience as well.
Yeah.
But in terms of practice shift, and maybe this goes towards answering your question somewhat, one of the things, so I don't emerge from exhibition making. I've never actually known how to curate a show. I mean, I've curated a few shows, but it's not.
Right.
So I emerge out of public programs and discourse and interdisciplinary practice and performance.
Yeah.
So or time-based art. And so for me, it was very easy to go, well, you know, this newsletter or this piece of policy or this sound work or this could be an artwork. I mean, who says that it's...
That's true.
I think the parameters of putting something in a room were never part of my own internal architecture, and therefore artistic practice as well. And I kind of have a feeling that artists are, I mean, this is a big generalization, but the practices are shifting in that direction, in the sense that the art environment is hopefully transforming in one where, you know, if you compare it to like film production or literary production, you don't enter the machine in the same way. You don't have to enter the same machine in the same way all the time. Although I say that, but sometimes I find myself in the context, you know, speaking to lots of commercial gallerists, and I'm like, oh no, there is a machine. I'm just like super outside of it, and I have no idea what that is, you know. But I guess sort of finding these, it's a question that I ask myself, like, how can these practices that might not fit within that machine find sustainable ways of, sustainable from the point of view of like livelihood, you know, like how can they be supported by an art infrastructure? Right.
What you just said that sometime back when you said in the new project you're doing, I think it's called Earth, Back to Earth. Or
Back to Earth, yeah.
Back to Earth, where you said you're looking at environmental organizations, environmental initiatives, which don't necessarily call themselves art, and what happened when you call them in the art sphere. But this is actually I have been asked this for the last 30 years, are you an artist or an activist?
Right.
And I say, well, they're just different forms of the same thing, you know, of my being in the world and being and reacting to something. They're just different ways of doing it. But this is a question which has sort of art has concerned itself about separating itself institutionally, when I really believe that it's like, you know, like Duchamp's, you know, toilet, you know, seat, which that became the turning point of what could be art, in a sense, the question they were. So I think we are so far down that line today that art to me seems to be the one place, the one broad sphere where you can have a general ecology program, where you can bring in a lawyer, you can bring in a COP26 scientist, you can bring a policy person, and you can also bring in somebody who calls herself an artist. And you can bring them together and call it an art program, because I think everybody exceeds themselves when they come to a conversation like that. They all speak more than they would in their own community, because they have a lot more to say than they have to say, than they usually get to say. And in a multidisciplinary conference I organized in 2018 at the Goethe Institute in Mumbai, where he had 3 days of multidisciplinary people, artists, activists, policy scientists coming together, and they all took away something from it. And I think it can only appear in the artistic framework. There is no other framework in which this serendipitous learning is possible anymore, because we've so contained ourselves in narrow silos. But what also you mentioned some time back, that with a bit of hesitancy about the word culture in the COP26. And I always think, why is culture not addressed? Because we've known for a long time that culture and change is totally interconnected. We are not separate behavioral beings. We are culturally behavioral things.
Yeah, yeah.
So because you are more than, I mean, your thinking is more than just thinking of art historically, but thinking of art in the broader sphere, institutionally as well. Why is this big? I know Amitav Ghosh has spoken about it in the Great Derangement, when he says, why does fiction not address great catastrophes? You know,
Right.
It's kind of that similar question. But we are still caught in this very, well, sometimes constraining, your project is unusual, constraining artistic institutional space. And how do we expand this when we think of multi-species world, which we are de-anthropizing the world. You know, we are seeing the world from another agency, another viewpoint. How does the land look to the sea? Not how do we see the sea, but how does the sea look at us? It's almost reversing the gaze. You know, of course, feminism has said that for a long time, reversing the gaze, but it's almost reversing up our gaze. So, what has been your experience, and what do you think about this radical proposition which art can bring to the kind of radical proposition which the word Anthropocene proposes and ecology needs, which COP26 refuses to address because it's too radical? But at least for me, I see that if you don't invert something, we are hurtling towards non-sustainability. We are on this trajectory of non-sustainability. And how do we do that? How do we, as a community of artists and non-artists, do that? Radicalize the requirement of, you know, if you agree with me, that is, if you think.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I wrote down, how does the sea look at us? And I'm thinking that I should probably have that sentence tattooed somewhere.
Yeah.
But no, there's something very beautiful and just a beautifully poetic way that you put it of looking at the stakes of this, that I really appreciate. And in fact, your project that is emerging as we speak, is, you know, feels to me like a really fantastic way of bringing that to bear. I mean, on the one hand, gosh, you've prompted so many different thoughts. On the one hand, it feels to me like there's a kind of responsibility or possibility of being the art environment being the kind of convener of an exercise of mutual literacy between the disciplines and specializations.
Lovely.
Because what I find so much is, like, you enter these contexts, I'm sure you feel this a lot, and there's like an oceanographer and a biologist and a policymaker, and it sounds like the beginning of a joke, and everybody speaks together at a table, and you could spend 8 hours around that table, and the first 8 hours would be spent with people talking about what they do, without having any understanding of how that intersects with, you know, because it's just different languages. So how do you then foster a kind of place of convening in which those languages are kind of begin to exist in relation to each other?
Yeah.
And then, so I had a conversation, I remember having a conversation whilst walking in the woods with someone who was working very closely with climate scientists, and trying to kind of draw their thoughts into a climate justice paradigm. And I remember going, you know, there's something of the artist in what you're doing, because you have a scientist whose vision has to like focus in, hone in, split up, and like really be very meticulous according to, you know, the paradigm of that particular scientific discipline. And what the artist does is sort of pull back and remind about I don't know who us is, but remind one of the connections, the complexity, the vaster picture, the planet, whatever it might be. And the reply that my interlocutor gave was, you know, I kind of have a feeling that the scientists are mourning the distance as well. And this mourning the distance really hit me, like this idea that you'd be there looking at this thing, knowing that the stakes are so much vaster, but because of the limits of your own discipline, the distance between what you're doing and wholeness, you know, and it is so vast that it creates a form of grief. So I guess the stitching together of that, like the mourning work, like the stitching together of that grief into some kind of reparative, into a rebirth in a sense, like a reparative thing, is a little bit the responsibility of culture and the art. And to that end, I think I'll just finish addressing these beautiful comments that you've made with COP26. More often than not, I mean, this is like, my parents are both very heavily influenced by psychoanalysis, so I'm sure there is something of that in me too.
Yeah.
More often than not, when the thing that is most absent from a context is actually the air that entire context is kind of in. It's like the water for fish, you know, it's like, you don't see it because it's everywhere. And so what I realized while looking at the agenda of the COP26 is actually maybe the COP26 itself is more of a cultural project, cultural, like logical, sort of propaganda project than it is anything else. And it is because it positions, for example, the UK in this year as, you know, a beacon of climate repair when it itself behind its back funds fossil fuel companies still. And it so if we start to look at it as a cultural project, then how can we formulate cultural projects that tell a completely different narrative and put different things on the agenda? Which is where then the agency, even though it's kind of an abstract notion, the agency of the art world becomes like really, not the art world as an industry, like the art industrial complex, but like the art of culture becomes like really crucial, maybe.
I think COP26 as a cultural project is a fantastic curatorial show. It's just so it can just take you in so many places to reposition, not try to see the absence of culture in COP26, but to see COP26 as the culture itself.
I mean, look at Maya Motley's speech. It's like it's one of the greatest artifacts of our contemporary world. Like, why is that not an artwork? It's an artifact of the contemporary.
That's right.
Really powerful witness to this current moment, for instance.
Right. So you also are doing a lot of shows working with artists, new artists, emerging kinds of practices, some of whom I know as well, you know, and also looking at different forms, you know, like this project with the Turn, which you are curating in the foothills of the Alps, right?
Yes, Himali Singh Soin's beautiful bird opera.
Yeah, bird opera. But this marriage between music, the idea of the solitary tern, the migratory bird, these are curatorial interventions which are very well address the contemporary world in very imaginative ways. I think no matter what the artist does, but I think to me the curatorial idea itself is fantastic because you are unlocking so many doors by proposing this, I think. And it takes a particular kind of consciousness and awareness and a sensibility to think of that as a trajectory into an invitation for a curatorial space, for a creative space, I think. And I think that is you know, despite all the criticisms which curators face as the relationship between curators and institutions and power they hold and all that, you know, I think this is the idea of taking somebody on a journey is the best part of being a curator, don't you think? Of being able to, it's almost like an artist curator,
I mean, jokingly, I describe our profession. I mean, you're an artist and an activist and a curator, but that part of the curatorial profession, I describe it as 50% psychotherapist, 50% wedding organizer. Because it has this like very intimate, like the necessity for a form of intimacy that brings you in relation with an artist or an artistic practice or project. Yeah. That is kind of super entangled and super intimate and like really profoundly mutually transformative. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's like an incredibly practical dimension to making these things happen. Yeah. So for me, the curatorial journey has always been one of like sense making, almost from myself. Like it sort of sounds horrible to say, but it's an intellectual journey of sense making that I follow from me. Yeah. And then, you know, in that process, you sort of uncover a sense of potentially greater purpose. Yeah. But it was no, I was just going to say, but it's really kind of sense making by following an artist's vision for sure, and then trying to put things underneath it so that it can happen. Yeah. You know, and then on occasion, like maybe the creative practice part is like stringing these thoughts together and kind of go like, so here's an incomplete but, you know, potentially compelling snapshot of how ideas kind of connect to each other and stuff like that. Right. And I guess, you know, this whole conversation, I'm conscious of the time of the whole conversation, which we can carry on for the next 1 hour as far as I'm concerned, is talking about the sensory and the affective and the undefined boundaries which the artist helps break or dissolve or sort of. And when we think of multi-species worlds, then we are essentially first have to break the barriers of this idea of you know, the separation between the human and the more than human or the non-human, whatever word one would like to use. The separation is already the first barrier. And so positioning oneself in something which helps reconfigure these boundaries, I think it's a great contribution to reimagining a world in a more radical way, because when we break down these boundaries, the propositions are all more radical, no? Because they are destructuring what we have, both institutionally and through our pedagogy of knowledge. We are destructuring all that. Would you think so as well? I mean, I have great hopes of the arts for finding solutions of our different way of sensing the world. Because I think the way we sense of the world is ultimately the way we construct it also. It's not the other way around. So, you know. Absolutely. Yeah. It's primary. Right. I'm just, I'm writing down quotes from you all over. Absolutely, definitely. What I suppose, I agree with everything. I suppose what I would say is that there's probably, just like kind of infinite complexity or something, we probably run into more unknowables than we sort of to try and know, as opposed to sense, as you just said, is perhaps a Sisyphean kind of impossible endeavor. But also, there's a lot about the human more than human interrelation. In fact, all of human more than human interrelation already exists. A little bit like nonlinear time exists in our experience. So how do we make sense of something that is already there? Again, it's like the water for the fish or the air. You know, how do we make sense of something and start to like really like exist within a relationship of what Elizabeth Povinelli would call obligation in terms of responsibility and political kind of responsibility as well. And what maybe theologians or others more spiritual practitioners would call forms of gratitude, something between obligation and gratitude. which is where I think that it's really interesting to also bring together these kind of spiritual dimensions.
Yeah.
But not without the historical materialist dimension, and not one without the other, kind of almost ever.
So thank you, Lucia. I'm just going to stop recording for a bit.